Hello and welcome back to All About Russia. My name is Andrew and today we're going to be looking at the largest ethnic group in the Southern Republic of Dagestan, the Avars. The Avars, known in their native tongue as Mongols, meaning Highlanders, are the largest ethnic group in the Southern Republic of Dagestan, making up nearly 30% of that republic's population. As such, they can be found across Dagestan, but are especially concentrated in these regions. In addition to the Republic of Dagestan, they can be found in Stavropol Krai, the Rostov Oblast, the Republic of Chechnya, the Republic of Kalmykia, the Astrakhan Oblast, and of course Moscow and the Moscow Oblast. Abroad, Avars can be found in Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, Ukraine, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. The name Avars is an exonym, a name given to them by their neighbours. There are three main theories as to where this name has come from. Firstly, it has been suggested that the Avars are the distant cousins of the Pannonian Avars who invaded the Roman Empire in the 5th century. The second theory suggests it comes from the Turkic word avarala, meaning warlike. A third theory suggests the name comes from one of their kings of the ancient kingdom of Sarır, founded in the 5th century. Interestingly, historically, the Avars have also been known by another name, Davlitsi, meaning mountaineers in Old Turkic, something very similar to what they call themselves. Throughout their history, the Avars have had other linguistically related groups classed as Avars themselves. However, today 12 sub-ethnic groups are classed as being part of the Avar larger ethnic group, subdivided into 4 categories based on language. This perhaps best reflects the chaotic nature of ethnicity and identity in the Caucasus, where 2 groups who speak completely different languages can be classed as the same ethnic group. The Avars speak their own language, which can be divided into northern and southern dialects. The Avar language is in the Avar Andean branch of the Dagestani language family tree. Within these dialects, there are variations based on sub-ethnic groups. These sub-dialects are, however, fairly intelligible with one another. Of note, not all of those classed as Avars actually speak the Avar language, once again highlighting the complexity of the Caucasus. Historically, their language was written using a Georgian script back in the 13th century, but later changed to an Arabic script as the result of Islamic influence in the region from the 1500s onwards. This then changed in 1928, first to a Latin script, and finally settling on the Cyrillic script they use today as of 1938.
Yırtar Hacı İsrail Ahmetoğlu Zunzaktaların ikinci kendusu 47 senedir.
As before stated, it is theorized that the Avars of Dagestan originally were the same group as those who arrived in the Pannonian Basin in the 5th century, and it is from contemporary Greek sources that we get this idea. These same Greek sources are the first written record of the Avars, citing them as having arrived in the Caucasus around 463 AD. They were described as a driving force for other ethnic groups migrating towards the Roman Empire. Whilst both the Pannonian Avars and the Caucasian Avars may have been the same group, by the 6th century there was a noted division between the two groups as written by Byzantine sources. Their arrival in the Caucasus in the 5th century was very significant, and they created their own kingdom known as Sarır in that same period. This in turn has led to additional theories of Persian origin, as many of the first Avar Kings had Persian names. Whether this is true or not, we don't know. However, it's worth noting that where the Avars are supposed to have come from are around the Caspian Sea, historically a region of Persian influence. The state of Sarır was nominally Orthodox Christian, having accepted preachers from neighbouring Georgia. The Avars allied themselves with the more powerful Khazars to the north during the Khazar-Arab Wars of the 7th century, Whilst initially successful in delaying the Muslim advance, by the 8th century the tides had truly turned, and the Kingdom of Sarır was paying tribute to the Emir of Derbent. Fortune is, however, forever fickle, and this situation had completely reversed by the 9th century, with the Kingdom of Sarır being the overlord not only of the Emirs of Derbent, but also of Shirvan, and actually having eclipsed somewhat the power of the Khazars to the north. This in turn made them the most prominent power in the eastern Caucasus. It is worth noting that during this century, the Avars also forged strong alliances with the neighbouring Alans, another Orthodox people. Throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, the Avar people suffered mixed fortunes. The rise of Islam in the communities of the Caucasus saw the Avar kingdom surrounded and quickly outnumbered. By the 12th century, the Kingdom of Sarır had fallen and was replaced by the Avar Khaganate, a Muslim successor state. It has been suggested that as the Kingdom of Sarır expanded its influence, it in turn was influenced by its Muslim vassal states. So perhaps this fall of the Kingdom of Sarır was less of a conquest and more of a coup. This newfound official embrace of Islam put the Avars in greater contact with the Muslim world, including the Khwarezmian Empire, with whom they forged an alliance with. However, when the Mongols invaded in the 13th century, the Avars more or less abandoned the Khwarezmians to their fate, getting off relatively lightly from the Mongol invasions. This in turn was likely due to the mountainous nature of Dagestan, where it was far easier to retreat to their mountain outposts than to fight pitched battles. This may have been the smartest decision the Avars could have made, as by quickly submitting to the Mongols, both their population and their position in the eastern Caucasus were maintained. The Avars, in comparison to other Caucasian ethnic groups, actually prospered under the Mongol yoke. This was more so when the Golden Horde converted to Islam, thus allowing the Avars greater social mobility within their empire. This period saw a cementing of Islamic tradition among the Avars, and whilst many of their native customs and religions were lost, not all of them were forgotten. However, this subservience to the Mongol state and ultimately reliance actually fared poorly for the Avars towards the 15th century. With declining Mongol power, the Avars were unable to resist the rise of a new power in the Caucasus, the Gazikumuk Shumkhalate. Like before under the Mongols, under the Shumkhalate, the Avars were allowed a great degree of autonomy, no part in due to the fact that they lived in very remote and mountainous terrain. Despite not being the ruling class of this new state, the Avars were the most numerous people of the eastern Caucasus, and thus held great sway within the Shumkhalate. Many Avars were able to rise to positions of both military and political significance within the Shumkhalate, and this situation would remain until the advent of the 18th century. The Shah of Persia was looking to expand his realm, and whilst many groups within Dagestan submitted relatively quickly, the Avars were not one of those. Using their knowledge of the local mountainous terrain, in 1741 the Avars harassed and picked off almost the entirety of the Shah's invading army, causing a domino effect within the other Caucasian peoples. This one defeat reversed all of the gains the Shah had made in the previous year. In turn, it also destroyed the credibility of the Gazikumuk Shumkhalate. Within 30 years, the Avars had overthrown their rulers and made the Gazikumuk Shumkhalate subservient to them. The emirs of Baku, Shirvan and Derbent were also subservient to the newly arisen Avar Khanate. In 1783, under the Treaty of Georgivsk, whole of Dagestan, including the Avars, was nominally put under the control of the Tsar of Russia. This was in contrast to before being nominally under the control of the Shah of Persia. In reality, the Avars had been independent before this point and would continue to be so for many years afterwards. However, in 1826, this changed. The Russo-Persian Wars of the 18th century had invoked a certain zeal among the Muslim Avars. Whilst they had historically been closer in influence with the Ottomans, who often sold guns to the Caucasian mountain peoples, the idea of struggle against the invading Kafirs from the north put a certain fire within the Avar people. When the Russian state began to introduce settlers and troops into Dagestan in 1828, this was the match which lit the Islamic tinder. Mullah Ghazi Muhammad rallied Avar, Chechen and other Dagestani peoples all together in a holy war against the invading Russians. This has often been called the Murid War and would last until 1864 as part of the wider sphere of the Caucasian wars Russia was fighting at that time. This time period, in many ways, helped define the Avar people, using the principles of Islam and Sharia law as a unifying force for all the peoples of the Caucasus. This promotion of Islamic influence was to try and rid themselves of the various slightly different traditions and cultural emphases of the various Caucasian peoples. The Avars were quicker to drop theirs than most. Being the most numerous people of the Eastern Caucasus, the Avars held great sway within this holy war. This is so much so that throughout the Murid War, all three of the mullahs who led revolts were of at least partial Avar ancestry. Interestingly, however, the religious tone of this war actually alienated some of the Avar nobility. They were worried of losing both their position and influence in their communities if superseded by Islamic influence and ideals. Thus, some Avar nobles actually worked with the Russians to help pacify the area, to cement their own positions within their communities. Naturally, this tore some Avar families apart, torn between their religious duties and their traditional loyalties. The Avars were a force to be reckoned with, and it would take nearly 40 years for the Russians to be able to control Dagestan safely. As we have seen with other Caucasian peoples, a brutal approach was taken by the Russians in pacifying the area. Those unwilling or unable to fight the Russians took ships to the Ottoman Empire, where today vast numbers of Avars lived in various Middle Eastern countries. Those who remained fought a brutal guerrilla war against the encroaching Russian forces. Imam Shamil, who led the struggle for the majority of the war, is seen as a cultural and religious icon within the Avar community. Interestingly, he actually had quite low opinions of the neighbouring Chechen peoples, who he didn't deem to be quite pious enough to really help in the struggle. This actually laid way for some enmity between the two groups. After leading the struggle for many years, eventually Imam Shamil was forced to submit to Russian forces in 1864, eventually submitting himself as a prisoner and going on to serve as a guest of Tsar Alexander II. Imam Shamil left the Avar people decimated. As many as half of the Avar population had either died or had emigrated during those 40 years. Remarkably, however, they were still one of the largest ethnic groups in Dagestan, showing perhaps the brutality that was inflicted across all of the Caucasian peoples. With the destruction of their religious emanate, they were given a district for them to control locally. As practicing Muslims, they were forbidden from joining the army. However, they were allowed to remain in their mountainous homelands. The Avars did try to rise again during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, but were quickly put down. It would be another 40 years until the Avars were able to throw off the shackles of Tsarism. With the outbreak of the First World War and the turmoil in Russia proper, the Avars rallied behind a descendant of one of Imam Shamil's helpers, Najmuddin Khotso. He declared a fourth emanate and would lead the Avars in revolt up until 1925. During this time, the Avars would fight against white forces from General Denikin as well as against Bolshevik forces, although the Red Army eventually would crush them in 1925. But in some ways, this opened up a new chapter for the Avar people, and not necessarily a bad one. In some respects, their inclusion into the Soviet Union led to some growth and development for the Avar people. New roads were constructed to allow travel between distant and remote villages, and an emphasis on employment and literacy amongst these largely agrarian and illiterate people was made. Now, the Avars were permitted to join the Red Army, and many did so, serving across the Soviet Union. The Avar language was nurtured and encouraged, receiving a new script in 1928 and a Cyrillic one in 1939. This was to help them master both their own language and Russian, which many did not speak. However, this was not all sunshine and roses, and these gains were marred with the brutalities of collectivization and the severe repression of religious communities. Devout Avars had to conceal their Qurans and were of course forbidden from making the Hajj. With the start of the Second World War, the Avars played an instrumental role in helping to defeat Nazi Germany. Many thousands moved to the lowlands to help run the farms and factories needed for the war effort. Many thousands more joined the Red Army to help fight the Nazi threat directly. The Avar involvement in the war effort helped cement them as a loyal nationality, a perk which would be used shortly afterwards. As well as moving down into the lowlands of Dagestan, many Avars moved over into neighbouring Chechnya in 1944, where housing had suddenly opened up. When the Chechens returned in 1958, this of course caused some hostilities. Many of our families were forced to flee back to Dagestan on fear of death. After Stalin's death in 1953, the Avar identity was taken to a back seat and a new one was promoted, that of the Soviet citizen. This, naturally, saw Avar language and culture also be relegated with the promotion of Soviet culture and the Russian language. Whilst these traditions were relatively easily lost in the big cities and on the plains, back in the mountain villages they were preserved. Thus, in the 1980s, when the Soviet thaw began, this rejuvenation of Avar culture and language began in earnest and relatively easily. The migration of the Avars during the 20th century across all of Dagestan made them the majority in the Republic, both in the mountains Avaria regions but also in the Caspian lowlands. In the late 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Wahhabism, whilst more popular in Chechnya, also found influence among the Avars. When Chechnya invaded Dagestan, whilst many Avars repelled the Chechen forces, there were actually Avars amongst them. In fact, this zealotry remains a big issue for the Avars and for the people of Dagestan at large. Infrequent terrorist attacks tear communities apart, and sadly, many of these are committed by Avars themselves. Furthermore, the celebration and advancement of Avar language and culture has actually put them at odds with other communities of the Caucasus and has seen some Avar and non-Avar communities even come to blows. Historically, the Avars were discriminated against by the Tsarist government, seen as a rebellious and dangerous Muslim minority. Within Russia today, however, there is no official discrimination. However, it is worth noting that some Russians do hold prejudice against the Avars, not because they are Avars, but because they are from the Caucasus. Traditional Avar dress follows a pattern seen across much of the Caucasus. For men, loose-fitting clothes under a beshmet overshirt with a shaggy cap for the cold mountain nights. Women's clothes are more varied, and this has historically been on purpose to help identify where an Avar woman was from. Each region would have their own particular style. Sometimes this even went down to village bases. Headscarves are popular alongside colourful dresses, with older women favouring darker materials. Interestingly, symbols play a large part in Avar culture, and this actually heralds back to their pre-Islamic days. Wolves, Maltese crosses and even swastikas are very commonly seen on both clothing and jewellery. Whilst modern Avars wear modern clothing, these symbols are still often seen on belt buckles and bits of jewellery. As before stated, the Avars are almost exclusively a Muslim people, following this Sunni sect. Like many of the people of the Caucasus, this religious identity is tied to their cultural identity. Whilst most elements of Christian or even pagan influence have gone, a few of them have hung around, particularly in the stories told by the Avar people. The Avars have a rich storytelling tradition, and their folklore include many ballads commemorating legends and even battles of the past. Being a mountainous people, the Avar cuisine is very meat-heavy, with lots of thick stews such as klinkal, often served with rough dough and made using lamb meat. As we have seen, the Avars are not really one people, but rather a conglomerate of various mountainous peoples grouped together by shared linguistic or cultural significance. This in turn makes them one of the most fascinating people of the Caucasus, with a rich history and fascinating culture. Thankfully today, Avar culture and language is thriving, thanks in no small part both to the revival from the villages and support from the Republic of Dagestan. My name's Andrew, thank you for watching. Up next are the Balkars. Paka!